Why not socialism? Today on The Curious Task, I speak with Eric Mack. Welcome to The Curious Task from the Institute for Liberal Studies, where we explore economics, politics, philosophy, and other ideas from a classical liberal perspective through discussion. I'm Alex Aragona, your host, and today our guest is Eric Mack. Eric is a professor emeritus of philosophy at Tulane University. A lot of his writings focus on the moral foundation of rights, the justification of property rights, historical understandings of economic justice, and the scope of legitimate coercion and the extent, if any, of the legitimate state. He is also the author of many books, including John Locke, Libertarianism, and The Essential Law. When he's not lecturing, he's dealing with the hard problems in libertarian theory that libertarian theorists are often thought not to address. Eric, welcome to The Curious Task.
Good. It's great to be here. Thank you very much.
Great to have you here. So Eric, as we were discussing before, in each episode we start off with a question and go wherever the answers lead us. So let's get right into it. Why not socialism?
Yeah. Well, we have to be clear on what socialism is, of course, to be intelligently against it or for it. And there's a transformation in people's views about what socialism is, or advocates of socialism have changed the target in various ways. So it's a kind of a moving target, moving object of assessment. I think the first thing that has to be said is that genuine socialism, especially in the 19th century when it rose, was really centered on the idea of the necessity of a centrally planned economy. Mm-hmm. And the driving idea more than anything else was that you couldn't possibly have a coherent, well-functioning economy unless it was centrally planned, unless some people at the center of political authority gathered all the information that somehow would be needed to know how different sorts of resources should be used, how different sorts of resources, including human labor, would be used, draw up a nice plan the way you would for constructing a bridge or something like that, and then order people to follow the plan. And the common view was that the alternative to that sort of a plan was a chaotic, anarchic, wasteful economy. So competition was wasteful. Competition was also involved conflict between people. If people would only act in accordance with an intelligently drawn up plan, there wouldn't be conflict of that sort, and everyone would know their place and their job. So in that way, it was actually in a certain way, fairly reactionary view. I mean, there was a wave of increased freedom and liberty in the West during the 19th century. And to some extent, it occurs to me that socialism was a reaction to a fear about that freedom and the thought that this freedom couldn't possibly work. And the only way we could continue to have an orderly society was actually to remove some freedom. Good. Add something, another sentence to it. This is similar to what you have earlier in someone like the philosopher Hobbes, who sees that the modern age is an age in which freedom is growing. He sees demands for freedom all around, but he thinks that freedom necessarily means chaos and conflict between people. And he decides that the only way to really have an orderly society is to establish unquestioned political authority. Hobbes doesn't think that political authority should plan the economy. That's not an issue he's thinking of. But I think in the 19th century, now that the more I think about it, the more it seems to me that it's useful to see the idea of a planned economy as a type of reactionary idea by people who are unable to adjust to the prospects of a world of much more free and autonomous individuals.
Were these ideas also strengthened by the fact that a lot of people within this ideology did sort of see that there were effectively two classes of people? You had producers and workers, and a lot of the workers felt that, let's call it, the future of the, quote, economy was sort of out of their hands, even more so than some people may feel that now.
Yeah, so there's certainly this dimension of the exploiters and the exploited, and no doubt that plays a role in it. I think the early French socialists actually didn't particularly worry about that. They were mostly just captured by this idea of organization. In Hayek's early and sort of informal book, The Road to Serfdom, he has these wonderful accounts of this intellectual battle between France and Germany at the beginning of World War One, where each side, in order to prove that they're the side that deserved to win, argued that they were the more organized society.
Okay, that's interesting.
And the other society, although it may look organized, they truly haven't yet gotten to the idea of organization. So I don't. Of course, there are these claims about injustice. Although Marx never spoke about injustice, Marx thought that was too moralistic, and when he decided that he was going to give a scientific form to socialism, he insisted that it was an economic argument, and it was the economic defects of capitalism, and therefore its inevitable collapse as an economic system, which was the justification for a socialist regime. Socialist regime is actually inevitable, but maybe we can give it a little push every once in a while.
So if I'm understanding, one of the things you just said correctly there is that although a lot of people, maybe even today, who consider themselves socialists, look at socialism as an answer to injustices that may occur under capitalism from their point of view, you're saying that some of the most original socialist thinkers actually didn't view it that way. It wasn't as much about the morality of the situation as it was about, as you said, the organization.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about people like Fourier in France, who were much more in the grip of this idea of organization, and I think proposed communities that weren't particularly egalitarian. That wasn't their interest. And there's no particular reason to link centrally controlled economies with egalitarianism. Somebody might think, I really want the sort of order, I want the stability that they believe will come about if only the economy is centrally planned, and that's it. That's why I want it. Right, and maybe it's because part of that order and stability will be maintenance of certain sorts of class divisions. So all of that is possible. And of course, I'm now thinking immediately of all the dystopian novels about socialistic worlds, and it's not much of a stretch when you see in these novels that it's a socialized world, but it's a highly hierarchical world as well. So there's no incompatibility. So you can favor the central control without favoring a type of egalitarian cause. But as we're talking, we'll see that the egalitarianism has become the dominant element. If you use the phrase egalitarian socialism, today it's almost entirely the egalitarianism that's doing the work. And that's partly because socialism, understood as a centrally planned economy, has been so deeply intellectually discredited.
Right.
So the smartest people who call themselves egalitarian socialists today don't really mean socialism in the sense of a centrally planned economy. They have to find some way to describe the system that they want as socialism, but it's usually some fancy footwork is necessary to do that.
Has over time the focus shifted, now we're talking about today, to the more moral aspects and the social justiceness of it rather than the organization?
Yes. And I think not just shifted in the sense that there's not been an explicit understanding in most cases that a centrally planned economy is not going to work, and not an explicit understanding of why that's true, but just a willingness not to talk about it, right? So we don't really hear very much about how the egalitarianism is going to be created or generated, right? But if one thinks of oneself as sufficiently egalitarian, you can also add the label socialist, and a general condemnation of capitalism, right, without a corresponding picture of what the alternative system is going to look like economically. So I mean, most people today in the United States and in Canada, I think, who call themselves democratic socialists, there's almost no content to the socialist part of that story, or who call themselves egalitarian socialists. And the meat is in the egalitarianism rather than in the socialism.
And when you mean that there's no content there, we're referring back to the economic angle.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So I mean, so there'll be particular measures which involve increase of state control of some dimension of the economy, and which are based on some presumption that at least this dimension of the economy, implicitly, the assumption is at least this dimension of the economy can be controlled and rationally organized by the state. But I think that assumption is almost never made even explicit, right? Oh, of course we're going to go in and we're going to plan this dimension of the economy, but for the sake of some egalitarian outcome. And the focus is on the outcome there and not at all on whether the means employed actually is going to work.
Right. So would it be fair to say then that right now anyone who is considering themselves a serious socialist right now, would it be fair to say that they are not really, as you said, for a variety of reasons, focused on the economics anymore? And in that way, as you were saying, would it then be fair to say that they are on the economic spectrum just maybe more left-wing progressives or welfare liberals, as some people say, or on that area?
I think that's true. For instance, if you think about the candidates, say, for the nomination in the Democratic Party in the United States, and those who will describe themselves as democratic socialists, I think, progressives, left-wing, think that more government in some ill-defined way is good, but don't have this picture that for at least 100 years was crucial to socialist thought of the century. The one exception I can think of, which is interesting, is having heard some interview some weeks ago by a representative of a party called something like the Democratic Socialists of America. And this person said, we like all the things that the people in the Democratic Party who are now calling themselves democratic socialists are in favor of. But we like them because that'll be a movement towards more state power, and those particular proposals won't work, and so we'll have to go beyond that to a truly centralized economy.
Right.
But those people are, I assume, in the vast minority.
Right.
People,
So you're saying there's a pocket of people, there's an intellectual movement somewhere that they're still, let's call it classical socialists.
That's right. That's right. And may understand what the more appropriate use of the term would mean.
Mm-hmm. But largely the people who are considering themselves, as you said, generally socialists now are some form of democratic socialist, or is that the same thing as market socialism? Because we wanted to explore that, or are we now needing to provide more backdrop for what that means?
Probably more back. I mean, as soon as someone says market socialist, they know that they've taken on a considerable intellectual task, right? Because of the common view, the common truth that markets and socialism, at least socialism as it's traditionally understood, is antithetical to markets, right? So that's got to be a sort of self-conscious intellectual enterprise to spell out what you mean by market socialism.
Right.
And we might get into some of the people who have tried to do that.
Right. Well, I think all of that actually provided a great backdrop for what socialism is or maybe isn't, or how it's considered today. I think one thing that, regardless if somebody is let's call it classical socialist or a democratic socialist, all of these people would probably say that the modern capitalist system just fundamentally creates things like greediness, selfishness, radical self-interest is a term you hear a lot. I think we were talking about G.A. Cohen's book, And Why Not Socialism. He sort of starts right off the bat and talks about, there's ultimately this dichotomy. You can have, for example, a camping trip where people are selling each other things like a fish if they catch one, or renting out pots to each other, or they can share everything. G.A. Cohen was probably, like, correct me if I'm wrong, of course, more of a market socialist ultimately towards the end of his life, or...
I think you can call him that towards the end of his life. He started out as a pretty straightforward Marxist, with a few exceptions. He didn't accept all Marxist doctrines. And gradually, as he shed those, he had to find this other form, this other type of structure, which he could still call egalitarian socialism. Because
Right.
he was committed to the term.
Commit to the term. Okay. So if he was, like you said, a straightforward Marxist
Yeah.
early in life and later on market
Yeah.
socialist, either way where you are on that spectrum, I think a lot of people would agree with his idea that, well, a capitalist camping trip would be terrible.
Yes.
A socialist camping trip
Yes.
is a good idea.
Yes.
Why? We're talking about why not socialism today. So maybe if that is a fundamental premise that a lot of people buy into, maybe you could tell us why it's fundamentally flawed.
Okay. So, of course, there's this issue of the centrally planned economy. If that's still part of one's, or very close to the center of one's conception of socialism, then there's just this remarkable argument that people like von Mises and Hayek produced in the 1920s and 1930s. I can give some version of that in like 3 or 4 sentences, I think. And here's the way it goes. And the idea, of course, is that a centrally planned economy has to eliminate market prices. Why would there be market prices? Since, after all, there's going to be no negotiation among people about contracts or the exchange of goods, because all transfers of resources are going to be part of the plan. But how do you know whether or not a particular use of a resource within a plan is going to be a rational allocation of that resource, whether it makes sense to use this resource, this input, to produce this output? And what Mises realized is that the only way you can know that an allocation is rational is to see how much more valuable the inputs are. But the only way you can know that the outputs are going to be more valuable by the inputs is by knowing what the prices are. So you need prices in order to know whether an allocation is rational, an allocation of any resources within an economic system. But centrally planned economies, by definition, eliminate the existence of market prices. So the central planner, in carrying out his mission to be a central planner, has to eliminate the very information that he needs to be a good central planner. So it's impossible to have a successful central plan. And we mentioned in the conversation that what happened in places like the Soviet Union was that when they had to plan certain sorts of things, in the absence of market prices, they would simply have to look abroad to other countries where market prices existed and say,
Right.
oh, so now we know what the value, now we know it would be insane to make buses or washing machines out of titanium. As soon as you see what the relative prices of these things would be, that's insane, right? Mm-hmm. So insofar as socialism and central planners made reasonable decisions, it was by being parasitic upon the information that was generated in the systems that they themselves thought should be destroyed.
So when it comes back to the camping trip metaphor that Cohen talked about, then of course, and I think you provided a great backdrop again as to why like this type of idea of everybody sharing and everybody exchanging things and forgetting about money can't scale. So I think we definitely covered that. But I guess I want to drill a bit more into why the conception that you can either share everything and have a relatively speaking either egalitarian or economy amongst 5 people versus a completely dispassionate, only self-interested camping trip. Why do people in Cohen's position or from Cohen's frame of mind think that that's the dichotomy, that there's no between? Because to me, it would seem that if I was going on a camping trip with 5 friends, the truth's somewhere in between. Yeah. My stuff is my stuff. Yeah. And, if they maybe wanted to go to the gas station, my truck or something off, they might want to throw $5 in, but of course, on a smaller scale, we'll share a sandwich or something. So why does he paint the picture that it's that far off from each other, that it's so black and white?
Yeah. So of course he wants there to be the greatest possible distance between his imagined camping trip and his vision of what happens in capitalist society.
Right.
And then the camping trip is going to be incredibly attractive. And on his vision, capitalist society is profoundly unattractive. And so it's a desperate need to show how the camping trip could be enlarged so that we could have a socialist society overall, not a capitalist. And I very much agree with both things that you said, namely that in reality, the camping trip is not nearly as distant from capitalist society as Cohen makes it think, because the camping trip is not as socialist or as egalitarian as he depicts it as being. And capitalist society is nowhere near as nasty
Right.
as he represents it being. So, actually, I've been on a lot of camping trips. I do a lot of camping. So I have some experience of this.
Can you safely say that either scenario is not what happens?
Exactly. And so, to just flesh that in, so Cohn says that, for instance, every material resource that people have, although they may bring what is nominally their own tents or whatever, their own sleeping bag, everything is treated as collective property on a camping trip. And he says that people's primary motivation on a camping trip is to bring about everybody's equal enjoyment. Right now, he's right that a camping trip is different from a normal day in workaday society. Of course, there's going to be differences. But people on a camping trip don't spend a lot of time tattooing their name on their tents or so on to make sure and say, be sure that you don't touch my tent. And so
throwing Post-it notes everywhere.
That's right. So it's a camping trip is a respite from a bunch of stuff, including, most importantly, from engaging in productive activity, right? And the big problem, of course, is going to be, can you have something just like a camping trip and yet actually have a lot of production going on? But the main thing I want to say about the camping trip is that people go, first of all, it's people who know one another, or people who know somebody who knows somebody. There's a second order connection, or people who are vouched for by other people. People expect to know and like the other people on camping trips. People on camping trips enjoy what they're doing. They're looking forward to the hiking and the jumping and the rafting, and they enjoy other people enjoying it because that just reaffirms the value of what they're doing. And people enjoy other people enjoying it, right? There's this sort of feedback of enjoyment that goes on. And actually, that's a very valuable form of community. It's a really terrific form of community. And you see it even if you're just out hiking for a day and you're in a fairly remote spot, right, and you pass somebody on the trail, you always say hello. You always say,
right,
if it's a really nice day, you go, beautiful day, right?
And we don't have those attitudes as a requirement of some sort of socialist arrangement.
That's right. That's right. And when you say beautiful day to somebody on the trail and they say yes, it's not like you're telling the other person something they don't already know.
Right.
Right? What you're really saying is both of us feel great for being out here.
Right.
And we also recognize that each of us feel great. And that's kind of nice. And I think that's the community on a camping trip. People don't go around in any way thinking about making sure that everybody has an equal amount of enjoyment. If something bad has happened, right, to somebody, people will say, "Oh, we sympathize. We understand why you're here. We understand why you feel bad." I've often seen people say, "We all had a great time, but Joe, he really had a great time. He enjoyed himself much better." And people are happy about that. They don't say, "Oh, no, that violated equality."
Right.
So there's this general disposition to have a certain type of enjoyment, and people luxuriate in it. And it's terrific. But it's not a socialist enterprise. It's not an egalitarian enterprise.
And it's certainly not the caricature of what the, quote, capitalist arrangement would be.
That's right. That's right. It's not that at all. So Cohn is right to say, right, people are not bargaining all the time.
Can I borrow that knife? Sure. You have $1. That doesn't happen.
That's right. But that doesn't indicate it's a socialist world. It's just a period of time where you're not doing that and you're doing this other thing that everybody recognizes everybody else is enjoying. Right? And so it's terrific. And then on the capitalist side, Cohn's picture is, it's funny because Cohn doesn't say what some people might say, "Oh, every person feels under the thumb of the giant corporations," or at this point in that book, he doesn't even talk about exploitation. He just talks about what he thinks is the awfulness of a standard day in market society where you want to go and buy something, or somebody comes to you and wants to sell it. And his view is that since those moments are motivated by people seeking their own advantage, right? I want to sell something because I want to get some money because, and he usually just stops there. I want to sell it because I want some money.
Well, that's on the small scale, and then when you branch that up, it gets terrible overall.
Well, but even there, it's terrible.
Oh,
it's terrible right
according
there.
To Cohen.
Right. It's not the sort of macro feature, right? That it's these micro features because he depicts this. It's not even that it's recognized that if I'm selling something and I want some money, it's because I want to be able to use that money to buy a piece of clothing for myself or buy a piece of clothing for my children. So he goes out of his way to use this. It's the cash reward that everyone is interested in. And he seems to have the view, even though he knows better, that if I get that cash reward, it's in some way by hurting the other person who's given me the cash. The other person I see the other person as a source of enrichment, he says, and I see the other person as a threat to my success. It's almost an exact quote. Source of enrichment, that means I see the other person as somebody that I can exploit, somebody that I can pursue my advantage in connection with, even to that person's disadvantage. And he's a threat to my success because instead he might succeed at exploiting me. Right. And so there's this view that all market relationships are deeply antagonistic, deeply conflictual.
Which, when you tie it back to his camping trip metaphor, he's saying if a camping trip was like that, it'd be terrible.
Exactly.
And I think that is a great place to take a break because we provide a brilliant backdrop for the rest of our discussion, and we'll dive more into this in a second. The Curious Task is a podcast from the Institute for Liberal Studies. Feel free to send questions and feedback to curioustask@liberalstudies.ca. A special thanks to our supporters on Patreon, including Sabine Elchidiak, Peter Jaworski, and Ken Dubian. Remember to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter @CuriousTaskILS, and rate us on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you're listening to The Curious Task. Eric, before the break, we were talking about, what we were really doing is providing a backdrop for our discussion today on socialism. And you were discussing the different kinds of socialism, and we were discussing G.A. Cohen's camping trip metaphor and how you basically had these diametrically opposed scenarios where on the one hand you could have a nice camping trip where people are sharing things and having a great time and everyone's worried about each other's enjoyment, et cetera. And on the other hand, you could have this completely detached, self-interested camping trip where people charge each other to borrow a knife or a fish that they caught or something like that. And you went into that very well before the break. Someone reading Why Not Socialism by G.A. Cohen for the first time. Let's say this is their first attack on these ideas. They might think, wow, those classical liberals and libertarians, those guys, that does sound terrible. They are selfish. But I think it's fair to say that you would certainly not view classical liberalism or libertarianism as an avenue that facilitates, unbridled greed and a terrible society. You would probably consider yourself a classical liberal libertarian because you think that things like cooperation and ultimately a civil society can result from it. So I figured let's get a bit into that. How does capitalism, markets, and that kind of arrangement actually facilitate cooperation? And let's talk about how we can properly counter these ideas from G.A. Cohen, because I mean, to someone reading it for the first time, as I said, it might be a very convincing argument, and I think he lays it out quite well in the book. Yeah.
So one of Cohen's errors, and it's a surprising error, is this picture he presents of capitalist society in which the only thing that moves people are self-interested considerations. And I don't mean that he ignores altruistic motives, although people have altruistic motives all the time. And self-interest here, we should be careful, doesn't mean gouging out other people's eyes is what I really like to do and all that sort of stuff. But I think he knows, and certainly we know from as far back as Adam Smith, that capitalism depends upon rule compliance.
Right.
It's not a sort of morally free zone where everything goes.
People are worried about themselves primarily and their self-interest, but it's within a framework.
That's exactly right. So Smith tells his whole story about how self-interested people can coordinate with one another through the market, and each ends up serving the other, and by serving the other serves his own needs. And he's very, very careful to say, and so this sort of system where people have their own private ends, their own private purposes, but see that the way to advance their own purposes is by helping other people advance their purposes, is a system that utterly depends upon people expecting one another to abide by a bunch of essential rules. And he calls these the principles of justice. And these are rules like don't steal from other people,
Right.
don't cheat other people, fulfill your contracts. The whole structure of a capitalist order depends upon people expecting themselves to abide by these norms and expecting other people to abide by those norms. And the more people expect this sort of norm compliance, the more an atmosphere exists in which people are willing to take risks, work hard. They have security that what they produce or what they get in trade will be theirs. But the crucial thing is that the interactions that are characteristic of a free market society all require that certain forms of treatment of other people, the attacks on people, theft from other people, breaking of contracts with other people, that those be banned, and they're morally banned, right? As say Smith, and Smith's best friend, David Hume, is actually the great advocate of this. And he goes through and shows why we all gain if we adopt the rule of not attacking one another. We all gain if we adopt the rule of not taking things that people have peacefully acquired. We all gain by all of us abiding by the rule that we keep our contracts, that we keep our sort of written promises. And the whole structure of a free market economy depends upon there being very considerable, doesn't have to be absolute or universal, compliance with these sorts of rules. Smith says that if you don't have that general compliance with rules, the society crumbles into atoms. And so Smith says, I can't possibly be advocating a society in which people are atomistic. I'm telling you that we can have a society where people are not atomistic because they're all working within the bounds of these moral rules. It's only if those moral rules, which are characteristic of capitalism and are endorsed by capitalism, it's only when those moral rules disappear or lose their grip that we become atoms. So it's just the opposite of the sort of unconstrained, bare, raw, naked self-interest that Cohn sees in every market reaction that interaction that he ever contemplates.
And it seems to me that for a lot of people, the word when you combine self and interest, that's what's kind of the dirty part for people. It's almost as if a lot of these thinkers start off by saying your own individual aims, we'd be in a better position today to defend it, because that's what ultimately it seems to me they're talking about.
That's right.
It's a mutually beneficial framework for individuals to pursue whatever aims.
And when Hayek presents a passage somewhere in which Smith says self-interest, he says, I prefer to change that to purposes.
Right, there you go.
And he's right, because it's not like we are born with somehow a set of self-interests, right?
Right.
There's no content yet to what we want, right? And people form various sorts of goals, various sorts of commitments, various sorts of relationships. And it's the flourishing of those things which are our projects or our goals, and we say, oh, those are my interests. But those interests are defined by all these attachments and all these connections and all these commitments that we've made. They're not just so, it's not like one is born and says, oh, what's in my interest? I'm capable of getting sensory pleasure, right? And so that's in my interest. and I'm going to spend my life maximizing that.
Right. And unless there's a system that prevents me from doing so, I'm going to go out of control along with all these other people.
That's right.
And it's going to be bad news.
That's right. That's right. And, as I try to suggest now, that a lot of these things that are, in some sense, part of our interest, part of our lives, what we want to have in our lives for our lives to go well, are things like family,
right?
Things going well for our family, causes that we believe in,
right?
Prospering. So you could all pack that into the word, it's my self-interest, but it's then lost, right? And so you want to be careful about this. And the classical liberal, if he ever says pursuing one's self-interest, really should mean, and I think usually does mean, pursuing this whole array of ends, which makes up the life that is valuable for you. And that's what people are talking. And so what people should be free to do is not self-interest, but pursuing the whole array of ends that people have seen or believe will be rewarding and give them a rich life.
Right.
And that's what classical liberalism is about, arguing that people have a right to be allowed to do that.
Right. And underneath everything you're saying is always, I find, it's this focus on the individual as the smallest unit of society. Of course, and I always like to say, Milton Friedman once said, we call it an individual society, but it's ultimately a family society. Individuals care about themselves and their families or their loved ones, whoever they may be. But the reason why I stopping to point this out is because the way certain people would talk about capitalism today is that the idea that we can either have self-interest in institutions or we can have a benevolent institution, say like a government, to arrange everything. And I find that a lot of discourse today about those two opposed points of views relies a lot upon the idea that whether we're going to go with the quote self-interest angle or we're going to go with a benevolent government, it's ultimately raised above the individual. It's always going over our heads in the sense. Nobody's bringing it right back down to the individual smallest unit. And that's what the classical liberals were focused on.
That's definitely true. So all the things I said about, you have to understand that if one properly understands what some people call self-interest, it involves this whole array of different things, including relationships with other people and the importance of relationships with other people. But nevertheless, that's still an individualistic view, right? It's still, we don't go to a person and say, whatever your goals or commitments or cherished ends are, you are now to be appropriately required to surrender them to advance the cherished ends of other people, right? So classical liberalism wants to provide this protection, right? It's a good thing for everybody to be able to live a valuable, rewarding life and to be able at least to pursue that. And what politics should do is not require one person to give up a valuable life for the sake of advancing, but to ensure that nobody pursues their own valuable life over anybody else's dead body.
And is that something that a socialist, whatever stripe they are, from the pure like egalitarian point of view, is actually against? Is that fair to say?
I would say, wouldn't want to say I'm against that, right? But does have to say that. So one thing I actually, so here's a sort of, sometimes people say hysterical example, but there are egalitarians who take up and address this, and it's the issue of eyeball redistribution. So imagine that there's a society of 12 people, and Sally is very lucky. She has 2 good eyeballs, and 10 of the other people in the society only have 1 good eyeball, and then Sam doesn't have any good eyeballs. A genuine egalitarian principle would at least require Sally morally to give up the 1 eyeball, right? Take it out, pluck it out, put it into Sam's eye socket, right? We're assuming this is feasible,
right,
biologically feasible. But
you're saying if someone takes that point of view seriously from a moral perspective, not economic, we'll put that aside, but from a moral perspective, you're an egalitarian.
Right. And not only that, but if Sally refused to do so, she should be required to surrender the eyeball. When the knock on the door takes place and people say it's the eyeball redistribution team, she has to open the door and travel with them to the operating room. And to not do that is unjust. This is a requirement of justice if one is taking a strong moral egalitarian stance. Okay? And maybe worse yet, right? Suppose that there isn't a Sam. There's just Sally with her 2 good eyeballs and 10 people with only 1 eyeball. That's unjust because it's unequal. The only way to solve the injustice is for Sally to give up one of her, to put it in the garbage can. Because otherwise you have an unjust world. So if equality, and this brings home what seems to me to be the foolishness of thinking that equality itself is a value, right?
Right, okay.
If we have a very unequal world, and some of that involves some people being well below the average and having a really tough time, they're having a really tough time is a bad thing.
Right.
But it's not the inequality, right, that's the bad thing. It's those people having a tough time. And so the appropriate response is it because of institutions that we now have that some people are having this rough time?
Right.
Can we change those institutions? Now, a socialist might say, yes, we have to change those institutions and institute some sort of strong redistributive system. But typically, classical liberals and libertarians will say, at least most of the time, when people are in those dire straits, it's because of the absence of freedom and the absence of markets and the absence of well-defined property rights.
But underneath all of that,
yes.
You're sort of saying that when you strip away all the policy considerations, like we said, put aside the economic arrangements for a second, you're saying that where the rubber really meets the road with these fundamental differences is on the one hand, if you have someone coming from a classical liberal perspective, they're taking a fundamentally individualist perspective where that comes with the benefits of, quote, self-interest, but ultimately the respect of the individual.
Yes.
Whereas on the other hand, you're saying if someone's a serious, quote, socialist or egalitarian, that they don't fundamentally believe in that individualisticness.
That's right, because the achievement of equality is a type of collective thing, right? It's not that this individual is in the state of equality or that, right? You have equality as a social condition, right? Not, and if you're an egalitarian in the examples I just gave, you can favor the example where Sally has the 2 eyes and everyone else has 1, and we require Sally to give up one of her eyes. You have a situation where nobody gains and no individual gains and some individual loses. And so if you're just looking at individuals, how could this possibly be better? But if you say, oh, but equality itself is good, right? Then it's a better world, right? And I think the individualism that is at the base of classical liberal or libertarianism says, no, you look at the individuals, you look at what's happened to individuals. And then if somebody's really badly off, classical liberals and libertarians, of course, are cautious about introducing state measures. But there can be times, right, where somebody is worse off because of some injustice that's been done.
Right.
Some not yet recognized injustice. And then, of course, coercive measures can be used to correct that injustice.
Right.
And then very often, of course, it's just the absence of the sorts of institutions that libertarians and classical liberals say, if present, would help all of us flourish. And so we want to bring those institutions to bear.
Right. So we've talked about socialism or egalitarianism from an economic point of view and talked about why that might not work. And we've also talked about it from, the moral point of view. And we had that great example with transferring eyes around. And I think that can stand on its own. If someone truly believes in that, then we're not going to solve that in an hour here in total. But all of that to say that after a discussion like this, a lot of people might be thinking, well, then what's the classical liberal answer? Do classical liberals even care about these issues? If someone is, as you said, having a rough time in the economy or is disabled in some way or things like that. I think there is this perception out there that classical liberals, libertarians, however you want to label that, and that neck of the woods, they simply don't care about these issues.
Yeah.
Well, is it fair to say that classical liberals are actually convinced of their method because they actually think their ideal arrangement for society actually works better to solve these issues?
Yeah, so I think the answer is yes to that. It'd be a mistake for anybody to say that under my preferred system, nothing would ever go wrong.
Right, of course.
And in fact, it's a bad move when people say, oh, it looks like the institutions you propose would fairly strongly tend to prevent people from being in really dire straits, but I object to these institutions because they don't include a guarantee, right? As though passing a piece of legislation that says people are guaranteed so-and-so is ever a guarantee.
Right, well, intentions and results, totally separate things.
Yeah. So, and I think the other thing that I know that I've experienced, so another sort of example that philosophers always talk about is the drowning child. And is there an obligation to jump in? Oh, I'll get my pants wet, my shoes might be damaged to save the drowning. And I think the standard view among libertarians, maybe sort of a little bit more hesitant among classical liberals, is you shouldn't be legally obligated to save the drowning child. You shouldn't be subject to punishment if you don't. But you're a shit,
right?
If you don't,
right?
And the response of people often is, well, we don't really believe that you condemn not saving the child because you're not prepared to make it illegal,
Right?
And that I think is a crucial thing for classical liberals to talk about.
Right. That's tying legality completely in tandem with morality.
That's right. Because what those people are proposing is that immorality be criminalized. But we all have different views about what constitutes immorality.
Right.
So this just creates a gigantic war in which each group that has a different view of morality has to try to capture the state to enforce its view and to prevent other people from enforcing their view of morality on them. And it also is testimony to people thinking that there's no force, there's no significance in people having certain sort of moral views. So I say it would be indecent for me not to save that child. It would be wrong. It's something that I should feel terrible about if I don't save the child for the rest of my life.
There could be social consequences
that's
as well.
Right. There could be
no one's going to talk to you or
right.
think you're a nice guy.
That's right. So you're right. So there's lots of things that can be done short of criminalization, right?
Throwing someone in jail.
All sorts of forms of ostracism, and that's dangerous because the wrong people can get ostracized by the wrong people with the wrong motives. But mostly, I think it's important to allow people the freedom to act on their own moral convictions, and I don't know. I go back and forth on how many people are likely to jump in and save the child. I like to think that if the saving is as low cost or non-risky, if it's a low cost, non-risky saving, almost anybody will do it. And the proposed legislation only says it should be criminal not to save if it's low cost and non-risky. So I think people will pretty much always behave in the way that the proposed legislation mandates, and therefore the proposed legislation is largely unnecessary. And it's dangerous because it sets this precedent of criminalizing immorality.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is one example of a moral conundrum.
Yeah.
But in reality, I think it ties back to what you were saying before, which is ultimately the classical liberal would be against the idea that the government should go around legislating a certain kind of morality. Right. And it's actually not only something we have to live with, but something that's actually favorable to have a society with varying different sets
That's
of
right.
morals, as
That's
long
right.
as they fit within
That's
the
right.
framework.
That's right. And again, a very sort of the very same idea that applies to sort of economic freedom, that it allows experimentation and different people can try out different ways of living, and we can get information about how well different ways of living works. Economically,
Right.
the same thing applies to non-economic life. And in fact, John Stuart Mill basically makes the argument for non-economic life, for the freedom of non-economic life in this way, although he hedges on
Right.
the economic freedom. And so, yes, you want people to be free to behave in ways that are contrary to the current moral consensus, at least free in the sense that they're not subject to legal punishment, because we may learn
Right.
a lot from that.
And I think it shouldn't go without saying that I don't think you'll find a classical liberal that would, for some odd reason, be legally against the idea that a bunch of people who consider themselves socialists might want to go on some hectares of land and do their own thing over there as their own commune. That's not something that I think shouldn't go without saying as well. They may have a personal, of course, moral and political objection to that, where they don't believe in that.
That's right.
But that's not fundamentally incompatible.
Yeah. No, and I mean it's more than not incompatible. I mean it's a direct implication.
Right.
I actually had tried this argument on a number of occasions and have been disappointed in its results. That is to say, I would be debating with say, a socialist of some sort, and it would be things on like what public schools should be like.
Right.
And I would say, well, I'm completely open to you and your like-minded people establishing schools of the sort that you want, right? It was just everyone should be free to use their own resources to establish any type of school that they think is worth establishing. And so all you have to do is grant me or everyone else the right to establish schools of their liking, and the answer has been no. No,
Right.
We know the way it should be done.
Right.
We will accept your offer of freedom, but we won't reciprocate it.
Right. I think one of the stronger arguments I've heard against the things we've been saying here is that the way arrangements are today creates a situation where one feels that they are effectively forced to participate in the system we have now. But I think it's safe to say that people like you and I would say, maybe that's true. This right now isn't actually the ideal classical liberal system. We're not going to go into that for 3 hours.
Yeah.
But I think that's also a fair thing to say as well, that it's not as if classical liberals are sitting here and saying, wow, what we have right now is perfect.
Yeah.
We're not going to change it. Right. Everyone's having a great time, and there's nothing to talk about.
Right. But I also think that there are all sorts of spaces in our society where people who are not standard in various sorts of ways can go and find a place for themselves. And my guess is that that's still considerably greater than in most societies in the world. So I spend some time out west, and I spend some time in little towns out west, and I meet all sorts of kind of different people who probably sort of bummed around for a while, wandered around for a while, stumbled into one of these little towns where they're used to there being other people who are and they find themselves a place to live. I mean, they find themselves a place to have a life. I worry that if the more and more we regulate life, the more and more we say you can't have any sort of a job at all unless you get licensed in a certain way and you can pass a certain sort of test.
Right.
So one of the people I know moderately well is severely dyslexic and really can't read, can't write, stumbled into this little town and just accidentally met a guy who needed somebody who could fix his construction equipment. And although this fellow can't read or write, he can fix anything. He doesn't have a license. If he was required to have a license, he would never get the license. And so one of the great things about a sort of complicated, multi-layered, multifaceted society is that there is more likely to be places for these people to build a life for themselves.
Right.
In a regulated society, it's much harder for that to happen.
And on this point of regulation, I think this is actually something that in different ways distinguishes somebody that would consider themselves a classical liberal from obviously a socialist, as we were talking about, and someone who might be also a conservative in a way.
Yes.
If they have very traditional conservative social views or even political views.
Yes, definitely. Another thing I sort of wanted to fill in here is that libertarian and classical liberals spend a lot of time talking about voluntary associations, and one of the things that people on the left or some sort of authority favorable position don't appreciate is the depth and value of all the different sorts of associations that people form, right? So there's this picture, right? And I think people have this criticism of capitalism and say, oh, well, there's just the individual, and then there's the market, and then there's the business world. And there's nothing, right? Everything
Back
else...
to that campsite analogy,
everything
right?
else
There's nothing in
is
between.
swept away.
Right.
But the crucial thing about a classical liberal world is that it leaves people don't have mandatory community. They're not forced into community, which they then have to pretend they like.
Right.
But there's this incredible opportunity for voluntary community. And it's real. I mean, I'm not a believer, and so I don't go to church. I don't belong to a church, but people have all sorts of wonderful, I think, rich experiences as members of churches. But there's all if you look around, you just see all different sorts of groups of people that have come together and have a genuine version of the community that socialists think will be somehow created by political authorities.
If you really look out there, there's tons of arrangements you can point to that aren't, quote, like what the socialists would think of as strict market arrangements. We're talking here today as part of an event put on by the Institute for Liberal Studies, right? And we didn't pay you to sit here at this podcast table, so that's another example. I think there's tons of examples everywhere.
So if I could I give an example? Is that
of course.
Good. So my son is a whitewater kayaker, which is a pretty dangerous thing. So it turns out that there's an international community of such people. You know, there may be a couple of hundred top whitewater kayakers in the world, and he can be in his hometown and somebody will show up and say, if you're going kayaking tomorrow, can I come with you? Well, he doesn't just say that. He says, I'm a friend of Joe who you met in Chile last year, and he vouches for me that I'm a competent kayaker. You don't have to worry about my drowning. My son says, fine, stay with me for 3 or 4 days. We'll kayak together. He goes somewhere else, the same thing happens. There are rules governing the conduct of kayakers, which have nothing to do with legal rules. So if you save somebody's kayak, somebody has gone swimming, which means he's gotten out of his kayak and the kayak has come down river. If you save somebody's kayak and bring them back, the rule is that person has to buy you 2 6-packs of beer.
That's a nice rule.
That's right. So, but there's this whole world of rules and understandings, and people's lives in all sorts of ways are built at the intersection of these communities, and all of that is voluntary.
Right.
And people don't even realize how valuable some of these associations are when they first enter them, but they grow and they become part of people's lives. And all of this in ways that can't possibly be anticipated by political authorities or replicated by political authorities. And it really strikes me as, if you think that the basic solution to people's lives is government action, then all of this stuff disappears.
Not even government action, but at the most basic level, someone else's ideal.
Yes.
Because one thing I like to say all the time is that classical liberals are proud that they don't have all the answers. You and I don't want to sit here and arrange society. That's not what we want to do.
Right.
So bringing it full circle, I always like to conclude like this. We've talked about a lot, but if there's one thing you want someone to take away from this conversation, doesn't need to be a few words, but 1 or 2 sentences. Ultimately, the main question here was, why not socialism? Let's sum it up. Why not?
Because I'm going to use this language, because individuals are sacred And in one way or other, socialism requires the subordination of individuals to the whole.
I think we'll leave it there. Eric Mack, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank
It was
you.
a great
My
conversation.
Pleasure. My pleasure. Great.
This episode of The Curious Task was produced by Alex Aragona and Sabine L. Chidiak. Our executive producer is Matt Buffton. The music you heard on today's episode was created by Lindy Voppenfjord. You should check out his other stuff online. The Curious Task exists today because of donations of time and money from those creating it and listeners like yourself. Check us out on Patreon and find out how you can support us and get access to exclusive offers. I'm Alex Aragona. Thank you very much for joining us on The Curious Task.